Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Right Mind podcast brought to you by the Institute of European Right here in Vilnius. And today joining us is a very distinguished guest. It's a great honor to have Volodymyr Yermolenko, who is a Ukrainian philosopher, president of Ukrainian Pen Society, the Pen chapter in Ukraine, and also a teacher and scholar at the great and historical Kyiv Mohila Academy. Volodymyr, it's a great honor to have you here.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure for me.
And you are, one of those rare philosophers who not only talk about politics with your students, but also practice politics in the most, we could say, radical way, doing a lot of efforts to support the Ukrainian military and the brave Ukrainian men and women who are fighting on the front lines, and also helping all the people who help to facilitate this great struggle. So you're kind of in a way as Socrates, who was also described as not only this provocative thinker, but also a brave warrior in his own day. So it's very interesting to hear a more nuanced reflection that brings about what war is as a phenomenon. That's I would think, and I wonder if you would agree, idea that war is a continuation of politics through other means, as von Clausewitz has formulated, and it's very radical. But you could also look it in a very different way. That it's also then that war is also about the philosophical and worldview understanding of the world of the human being, values and concepts at heart. And I would probably say that this current conflict between Russia standing as this authoritarian, repressive empire, and Ukraine as a sovereign, free, and democratic, and also a very, very free-spirited nation. So it's also a conflict not only of two countries or two sovereign powers, but also a conflict of fundamentally two understandings of the world, of what it means to be a human person.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the formula of Clausewitz can be reversed, because I think that for the current Russian Empire, actually, it's not politics, it's not war that is continuation of politics with other means. It's the other way around. Politics is considered as a continuation of war by other means. And I think this is how the Russians consider politics. What I mean by that is that even political struggle for them is a kind of is a sort of the war. And if you understand it, you understand where does this idea of weaponization come from? We talk a lot about weaponization of information, weaponization of energy. Well, for the Russian Federation under Putin, and a lot of other elements of their history, they're trying to use different modes of how to wage a war. And I think this is something that it's very difficult for Western Europeans to understand, because Europeans rather tend to interpret everything in terms of peace, at least after the Second World War, while Russians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, tend to interpret everything in terms of war. And I think this is a dramatic difference, which also explains why it is so difficult for Western Europeans to accept this new reality. Unfortunately, this is a new reality. Russia is waging the war not only against Ukraine, but against the broader European civilization. So if you ask me, does the war bring something good? I would say no. The war is bad, is dirty, is horrible, and we need to avoid it with all means. But it's not accidental that we have this concept of just war, the war which is just, that comes from the ancient times. This comes from Greek and Roman thinkers, but then it comes from the Catholic thought. Because basically, if there is somebody who goes into your country, who goes into your apartment, and who wants to make violence against you, what else? What other choice you have? And I think that this is very important to understand, that Ukrainians said, okay, either we die or we just let the aggressor just go over, or we fight. And Ukrainian history is not a history, is a history of people who became warriors in a situation when there was no other choice. You have this Cossack myth in the Ukrainian society, in the Ukrainian history, but I think even deeper there is this myth of an agricultural worker, or a person who works on his or her land, and this kind of idealism of being a part of nature. So the answer is that the war is horrible, but at a certain moment you have no other choice than to defend yourself. And coming back to your another part of your question, I do think that it's also a conflict between different systems. I would say that on the one hand you have a system of values which is European one, which says that the society needs to be based upon the idea of rights, that people have rights as individuals, as communities. And when I'm saying it's European, I don't mean that Europe is ideal for this. I mean, Europe did lots of crimes in its history. Europe did lots of ways to deny this idea of rights. But it's interesting to look at the history and present of Europe, how it goes more and more to this idea of rights, plurality of rights. While the Russian system is based upon the idea that only one person has a right, meaning the dictator, the autocrat, all the others don't have rights. And I think this is really something very opposite to the idea of Europe.
Well, I think I really agree with a lot of what you said, but I really think that there's another issue when we talk about how Europeans think about war, and especially about this war, because they think exactly through the paradigm of perpetual peace, as Kant suggested, and Russians are thinking more in the sort of classical fascist paradigm of perpetual war, that everything is a perpetual struggle, and we should not only shy away from it, try to moderate it, but to embrace it. But I think also behind it then are certain intellectual mistakes that the Europeans are doing towards the way they try to understand what Russia is pursuing and how Russia is functioning, because they try to compartmentalize war as a phenomenon, that somehow war and trade and social cultural processes are somehow separate as phenomena. Whereas, like, if you really look, and you don't have to be, any kind of esoterical criminologist. You just have to look at, what official Russian figures from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their Duma and the Kremlin itself are declaring. It will be very obvious that Russia understands, for example, diplomacy, economics, trade of resources exactly as weapons that can be used to further military and geopolitical gains. And so this trying to separate this as if, we can still have some trade or, cultural exchange with Russia, and maybe that could even help, and then, try to separate it from the war, etc. I think it's extremely naive, and I would think that it really goes deep in the way that how we think, what kind of intellectual interpretative tools we use, or what kind of political imagination we use to understand things.
Yes, because it goes very deep, and I think it's a very good point that you make. I think Europe is analytical, and Russia is synthetical. So the major element of the European thinking is analysis, is distinction. So it's an art of distinction, while the major element of the Russian thinking is merge different things into one. Therefore, it's very holistic. And therefore, there is a certain attraction for the Western Europe in Russian thinking, because they think that this is kind of this holistic element, this more organic, and everything, you put everything into one thing, which I think can be fruitful, but in a certain way, it's extremely dangerous. And therefore, you have the big Russian philosophy of all unity, pan-unity, by Vladimir Solovyov. Which I think is, it can be attractive for somebody. For me, it's extremely dangerous, because it basically ignores the distinctions. And when you say, well, why it is very practical, because, for example, Putin says that Ukrainians do not exist because there is no distinction between Ukrainians and Russians. And then, therefore, we need to start a war to prove that there is a unity and not distinction. Well, I think distinction is very, very important. So, yeah, I do think that, and there is another interesting thing, is that for European intellectual culture in the 20th century, the role of the word, the role of the speech, of the message, of enunciation, is to criticize. And this is the role of intellectuals, for example, to criticize power, to stand up to the power. And it's very interesting how you see that European culture is developing from the idea that, let's say, literature should praise something. And if you go to epic culture, to Iliad, Odyssey, or whatever else, so the role of the word, the role of the literature is to praise the glory of something. And then, at a certain moment of time, you mentioned Socrates. Maybe it was in Socrates. Then it probably was during the Renaissance. Then during some other times, the role of the word and of thinking was not to praise something, but to criticize something. In the Kantian sense of the term, criticism doesn't mean the negation, but showing the limits of it, showing the borders of it, the distinctions. Well, I do think that in the Russian world, it's completely different. And when you look at how the Russian intellectuals were developing after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have this trend which is called methodologies. And their idea was how we develop a thinking, how we develop reality which will be as close to thinking as possible, and how we develop a thinking that is as close to reality as possible. So it's kind of the Hegelian or Marxist thinking. And therefore, the goal of culture, you mentioned culture, the goal of culture is not to criticize government, but to support government and to make it stronger. And this is why Ukrainians, for example, are so skeptical about Russian culture. And it's totally misunderstood still in the West, because people in the West consider that, okay, but culture should be autonomous. Well, but in Russia, it is not. It is not autonomous. It's a tool of power, because this is the way how they perceive ourselves. Culture is expression of the great Russia in the same way as weapons are expression of the great Russia, and in the same way as all other things are expression of the same thing, because there is no distinction. So I do think that we need to, if European way of thinking is about distinction, we also need to understand what is the peculiar about that thinking, Russian thinking, which is not the same as European.
Yes, I would very much agree with you, and also remembering Isaiah Berlin, who was, Jewish British intellectual, but he was born in Riga, not far from here, and he was really well versed in Russian culture, Russian philosophy, and was very critical of it. If you would read his famous essay on silence in Russian culture, it's a scathing dismantling of this sort of, especially this sort of holistic, monistic way of thinking, but also, in his other essays, exactly, he criticizes philosophical monism as this short, a very easy path to totalitarian thinking and then totalitarian practice. And that's, the Russian expression "всё одно." It's a very also nihilistic expression at the same time. Like, whatever, whatever the morals, whatever, And I think it really connects to the way Russia wages war as well. They're not making distinctions between civilians and combatants, civilian infrastructure and military objects and so on. I think it really connects deeply to a certain intellectual tradition. It's not just carelessness or barbarity. It's something more subtle, but also thinking about, exactly this allure of monism and how Russian culture functions politically. Even if we would look at, all the sort of, very often we would hear, especially in the West and in particular here in Lithuania, we should separate culture from politics. But, still, Russia still has ballet, Tolstoyevsky, and, all these cliches, which is basically, 19th century culture. And then you could argue, Russian culture now is something very different. But even if you would look at these sort of quote-unquote great Russian cultural figures, they're very paradoxical in the sense, Pushkin and Dostoevsky, they had problems with the state on the one hand, but they still remained very imperialistic, chauvinistic, and it's like young Dostoevsky was almost shot, and executed for sort of being maybe a revolutionary, and then he goes on being to this extremely conservative chauvinist imperialist. And he praises the sort of the autocratic way of life, that there should be, this one leader, one sovereign, samodержавец, and so on. And it's very important, I think, also to understand these tendencies, that it's not just an accident or some mistake. This is a system. There's method to this madness, to quote Shakespeare.
Yes, I think that we should not, of course, essentialize everything, and I'm far from saying, okay, this is their destiny and they will always be like that, because I really want them not to be like that, because otherwise they will keep attacking Ukraine all the time and attacking Lithuania and attacking other nations. So I really want them to change, but I think we need to diagnose this, and I think you're right to say that in the Russian culture there is a lot of it. I think we need to be distinctive and go case by case. In Russian poetry, there are people, for example, like Kondratij Ryleyev. Still, we have in Ukraine streets named after him, who was, let's say, more sympathetical to Ukrainian rebellions. And then he became a Decembrist, and this Decembrist revolt in 1820s, which basically was one of the, I think, the only probably big political revolt in the 19th century, right? So Pushkin is unfortunately not qualifying for this role for me as a big fighter against Russian imperialism, because he has very, very imperialistic statements in his poetry. Poltava about Ukraine, which is kind of a very denigrating towards the Ukrainian struggle for rights, and his To the Slanderers of Russia, which is basically saying that all the Slavic nations need to go to the Russian Sea, as he says. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, they have a lot of symptoms of this imperialism, and I think you're right. And it's interesting you mentioned Dostoevsky. There is another figure of the 20th century, which is Solzhenitsyn, who also had experience of the extreme, horrible camps. But then when he comes out of the camps, and he becomes a Russian nationalist, imperialist nationalist. So there is this paradox, very strange paradox. And I think the paradox is that the way how Russian society is organized, And in this way of organization, basically the role of individual is very small. And the individual feels himself or herself empowered by the idea of the Great Russia. So I can only exist if Great Russia exists. I think this is the problem. And this problem is very deep. And it goes into the Russian opposition, it goes into Russian liberals. By which I don't mean that there is no hope. I still maybe well, at least I give them a chance. I give the Russians a chance to rethink their culture. And I think they have a number of writers which I consider good and respectful. The most of them are absurdist writers like Daniel Harms or somebody like that. And they, of course, became the victims of the regime. But I certainly against this idea that culture is beyond politics. No, we should be very careful about this. We should analyze and scrutinize this, because politics is a continuation of some thoughts, some ideas, and these ideas are very often expressed by culture.
Yes, and I also think exactly, I wouldn't be on the side of people who are, cultural determinists, that, that something is predetermined already by culture, but I would more suggest thinking about a cultural tradition in terms of hermeneutical horizon, that it gives us tools to interpret and understand the surrounding world. And the problem that I would find in Russia and Russian culture is exactly the lack of resources for anti-imperial critique, for colonial critique, for pro-democratic sentiments, etc. There is a lack of resource to use there, and I think that's a big problem. But I wanted to divert the question, because another element is, of course, this what I found very. You mentioned the Russian opposition. And what I still found extremely prejudiced statements, like even if they come from what they think is a noble sentiment or whatever, they still end up falling into these cliches. And of course, talking about poets, we can also remember Josif Brodsky and his slanderous also poem on the independence of Ukraine, which is a reference to Pushkin's Poltava and all this sort of denial of Ukrainian cultural identity. And again, this person was a dissident, but then still embraced Russian nationalism and imperialism and so on. But another case I would like to point the attention to is Russian historian Alexander Etkind and his book Russia's War Against Modernity, where he frames everything, sort of how there is this Russian version of paleo-modernity and so on and so on. You can agree or disagree with it, but what I found extremely perplexing about the book, and I think it really demonstrates a lot of things that are wrong with the Russian opposition, is there is a sort of the colors of the Ukrainian flag on the cover art, but there is very little knowledge or understanding of Ukraine if you read the book itself. For Etkind, Ukraine is basically a mini version or an alternative version of Russia. He even frames the conflict between from a political elite's standpoint of view, that this old boomer Putin with his surroundings, people who are in their 60s and 70s, against young Gen Xer Zelensky and so on, as if it was a conflict of generations. But it's but the most angering thing for me was, and I'll quote exactly where he stumbles already in the first sentence of the first chapter, and he writes, before and during the Russo-Ukrainian war that began in 2014, modernity was big an issue for Russia as agency was for Ukraine, end quote. And for me, that was already agency wasn't the issue for Ukraine. Exactly, that was the Russian perspective, that on the one hand, the Russian state propaganda and their politicians were denouncing that Ukraine has agency. But on the other hand, their sort of anger and actions were directed by the fact that what they saw as overabundance of agency. And again, this issue, falling into these cliches, and this book is full of these kind of Russian imperialist cliches, and why I'm bringing Alexander Etkin to attention, because he's exactly one of those, I would say, good Russian historians who write about Russian imperialist historiography in the 19th century. He really understands, how Russian imperialist thought formed in the 19th century. But then when he's trying to rethink something about what Russia is now, he fails already at the first step. And so this lack of reflection for me is on the one hand symptomatic of what's going on with that society and that state, but also perplexing to some extent.
Well, I think, this is the story of Russian westernizing discourse, which, as Ukrainians say very often, that practically all the Russian Democrats end up on Ukrainian question. And I would say it's not only Ukrainian question. Like, the Russian Democrats rarely talk about nations who are in the Russian Federation, actually, because it's a very broad question. If you start saying that Ukrainians are a separate nation and they deserve this separate way of living, you need to continue and say that Bashkirs are a separate nation and Tatars are a separate nation, and the Republic of Sakha should be independent, and the Buryats, etc. So I think they're fearing the opening up a Pandora box, the real de-imperialization of Russia. They're really fearing it because, the drama of this war for them, it's a tragedy for us, but for them it's, I don't know how they frame it, because they killed a lot of their own people. But I think intellectually the drama of it is that if they cannot prove that Ukrainians and Russians are the same, how can they prove that Russians and Buryats are the same? It's much more difficult to prove, or any other, non-Slavic nations in Russia. So this is the first point. The second point, I think, what is really problematic is that, they depend on Ukraine in their vision of their own history. And therefore, the relation between the colony and the metropole in Ukrainian-Russian relations are much more difficult, because you can say that Ukraine is a metropole and Russia is a colony. And for example, when Russians are saying that Ukraine is a deviation from Russia and a kind of a minimal form of Russia, whatever, and as Putin say, Ukraine is anti-Russia. Well, Ukrainians can say that Russia is anti-Ukraine, that Russia is a deviation from Ukraine, because we had a state which was called Rus, which was a combination of Slavics and the Scandinavians, and then there was a Khazarian element, and before that there were Scythians, so Irano-speaking nations or whatever else. But this was never a tyranny. This was a kind of very European way of very pluralistic feudal state. And we can say that Russia is a deviation from this form because it built a tyrannical, very centralized way, right? So, and I think that they're very uncomfortable with saying that Ukraine and Belarus, by the way, as well, have a separate history, because that would make them headless. That would make them like, okay, but that means that Russia was born only after the liberation from the Mongols, and that means 15th century, and kind of where is our medieval times, where our ancient Greek? So it's important how Russians are right now looting the Ukrainian museums in the south, like in Kherson and Melitopol, and they're taking elements of the Greek past in Ukraine, elements of the Scythian past, because they want to show this lands as empty, without history, without the past, and annex the past, as my friend Alexander Sushko said, and I always quote this: before annexing space, you need to annex time. Before annexing territory, you need to annex history. So that's what is happening. And well, I remember Atkind was very angry at me when I wrote an article about Pushkin and imperialism. And I think that he was angry precisely. His emotion was like, how dare you, Ukrainian, to have a judgment about us, the Russian history. Well, I think that it is precisely Ukrainians, precisely Lithuanians and Belarusians and Poles and Georgians and Moldovans and Tatars and everybody else and Bashkirs and who have the right to make a judgment, because we are on the side of the victims. We are on the side of those who were suffering from these perpetrators. And in Ukrainian culture is a very widespread thing. We have plenty of works of literature of Ukrainian authors who are, sympathizing with Crimean Tatars in Crimea and telling their stories. We have some of them who were in the 1930s found themselves in Central Asia, who were writing the stories of Central Asia. We have Taras Shevchenko, who is drawing the Kazakh peasants with lots of humanity. We have Shevchenko, who is writing the Caucasus, the poem in which he says his famous phrase, "Борітеся, поборете, fight and you will win," which is one of the slogans of the Ukrainian struggle right now. But it was directed not to Ukraine, but to the peoples of the Caucasus, while in Russia we mostly have the colonial discourse about the Caucasus from people like Lermontov up to Tolstoy. Yeah, so you need to change, and you need to change when I speak about also the Russian culture, the Russian intelligentsia. They need to integrate that other perspective that precisely stresses this distinctiveness and difference. And even among people who, are critical about this war in Russia, who are criticizing this war, you still have this element that, okay, but why this war is bad? Because Russians and Ukrainians are brothers. So you have the same narrative which says, but we are the same. Why start war against it? And Ukrainians are saying, no, we are not the same. We have a right on our distinctiveness. We have a right on our own identity, on our own culture.
Actually, you brought me to the next theme that I wanted to explore a little bit, is exactly Ukrainian identity and how now is. Let's not go too deep into history. For me, and probably to the listeners of this podcast, it's very clear that Ukraine has very separate cultural and political identity, and identities within the Ukrainian identity in different regions. Very rich history with smaller ethnicities also becoming part of one Ukrainian nation and so forth. But how has the Ukrainian identity or sort of self-awareness has changed over the last decade? And I want to illustrate it with the question. I remember I was in Kyiv in early 2014, right after the victory of Maidan, and also just before the first Russian troops appeared in Crimea. And there was this very clear, if you would talk to people, there was this sort of ambiguity towards Russia then, because people were against Putin and the Kremlin interfering into our political affairs, but Russia is still not understood as quite the enemy, and war seemed for a lot of people back then unimaginable. There were some who already talked even before that and saw it coming as an inevitability of Russian imperialism. But if we would talk just more or less intellectual people on the street in Kyiv, it was still hard to imagine a war between Ukraine and Russia. And then it started, and looking into the Ukrainian public sphere, you could see the shift over the years taking place. That, well, it then became, instead of something that was unimaginable, the political imagination shifted to that, it's inevitable and unimaginable otherwise, that we will go out of this conflict somehow without a resolution of some sort, which will have a price. Even before 2022, there already was this discourse, that Ukraine is moving up, sort of on an upward trajectory as a society, as a nation, culturally, politically, economically, and so on. And Russia is this, empire that is trying to overreach because it's kind of sensing its impending doom, and then it might be desperate and might do something. But for me, it's interesting, how would you see the Ukrainian debates on identity, culture, and political understanding of the Ukrainian state, how that has changed over the last decade, but also especially since 2022?
Well, obviously we have the kind of the reappreciation of Ukrainian culture and language, and we have like flourishing of the Ukrainian culture, of Ukrainian literature, which is kind of this flourishing despite the war. And I think it's very important that this is doing despite, in a situation when probably are absolutely unfavorable to this. But then it's true that you cannot understand Ukraine as mono-ethnic and monolithic in a way. It's very plural. And I give you one example. I have a friend, soldier, in the south. He's from Mariupol. He's lost his hand during the counteroffensive of 23. And we go visit them very often. We bring cars to the units. And he was asking me, so Mariupol, so on Azov Sea, he was asking me, so he's very interested into the steppe history. He's like very into archaeology. He loves all this. He was showing us the remnants of kurgans, where he would show the stones with remnants of what he thinks to be Scandinavian runas, So it's like very interesting guy. And he asks me one day, so where do you think the Scythians are gone? So the Scythians, described by Herodotus, and Iranian-speaking people that were in the Ukrainian lands during the Herodotus time. And I say, I think you are the Scythian. And he says, that's the correct answer. So you cannot understand Ukraine without all these mixtures of everything. Basically, Iranian-speaking nations, Turkic-speaking nations. You cannot understand the history of Cossacks without these Turkic influences. The Cossack itself is a Turkic word, and the way how Cossacks were dressing themselves, the way how they're waging the war. You can say that there are lots of influence from Crimean Tatars, from Keremli, from the Turks, with the difference that they were Orthodox, Christian, and not Muslim, for example. The Jewish element, the Jewish culture in many, many places, unfortunately, tragically after because of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and by the way, also the very anti-Jewish politics in the Stalinist Soviet Union, and then afterwards, we kind of lost a lot of it, but now there is the reappreciation of it. So we have Jewish, Christian, Muslim elements. I love to show to the visitors of PEN Ukraine our office, which is located on one of the old hills of Kiev, and saying them, look, the street that leads to us is called Olehivska, and Olehivska means the Prince Oleg, and Prince Oleg is most probably the Danish spiritual figure Helgi, who probably fled Denmark and went here. So you have this Scandinavian element here. 100 meters or 200 meters above, you have one of the biggest mosque, the Muslim. Then if you go a little bit down, you have the Christian Protestant church. Then if you go to Podil, you have on the one hand where the Jewish town was, and on the other part of the street you have the former Polish town. So all this is Kiev, right? It's very multinational and multi-ethnic and multi-confessional, and this is the way to understand our history. So I think I always give this kind of metaphor that, of course, the Ukrainian elements should be in the center because we are called Ukraine, and this is kind of a sun. But around the sun, you have all the other elements, and we need to learn how to combine it. But for me, the identity is not only national, like in ethnic sense of the term, it's also political and civic. And here we have quite a big difference with the Russians, with the way how we organize ourselves, because I think the Ukrainian way of political organization is mostly grassroots. It mostly comes from the bottom up, is based upon the idea of a community and not the idea of a dictator. And if you look how, for example, Ukrainian anarchists and Russian anarchists was quarreling between themselves in the 19th century, you have precisely the same idea, because Ukrainian anarchists were saying, okay, we need to kind of diminish the role of authoritarian power. We need to give more rights to communities, to workers. And Russian anarchists were saying mostly, okay, we need to kill the Tsar and then to put another one on his place. And where does it come from? You can say it comes from the Cossacks, because Cossacks was a very interesting thing, because it was the army, but the army very decentralized. Usually the army is very centralized. Okay, but maybe it comes earlier. Maybe it comes from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and this very kind of a more or less republican spirit that was in that time. Or the Rzeczpospolita, which is translation of Respublika, right? Republic. Or maybe it comes from the medieval times, because Rus, centered in Kiev during medieval times, was very pluralistic. There was just it was like Germany or Italy at that time. Lots of, municipalities, city-states that were sometimes in peace, sometimes in war with each other. Or maybe it goes deeper. And right now, people are talking a lot about this archaeology, that in Ukraine we have these mega sites of 6,000 years ago, and they're older than the Mesopotamian cities, and sometimes call them proto-cities. And the anarchists of the world are happy to say that, well, contrary to the Mesopotamian cities, these mega sites didn't have the signs of administrative buildings. So probably there's just collection of 10,000 people who were all the time agreeing between themselves how to rule. But it was 6,000 years ago. Were these people Ukrainians? Certainly not. But, everything, as Tim Snyder recently said in our conversation, history is about how events which are happening now were influenced by events that happened in the past, and how you have this gradual influence going on. So I think in a way it goes very deep, and I think for me it's very interesting to speak about, to think about Ukrainian identity as republican, politically republican, not tyrannical political identity, and therefore it of course makes us very European. My sense.
Yeah, I would agree, and some of the intellectuals who also talk about connections between Lithuania and Ukraine. It's not only the times of Rzeczpospolita or the Grand Duchy, but broadly the connections between the Jesuit sort of educational influence, and in Vilnius we had the Jesuit University opened in the 16th century, but also the Jesuit intellectual influence on the Kiev Mohyla Academy and so on. So there's a lot deeper connections that would tie Ukraine, even though it's not a Catholic country or a Protestant country, but there are other also deeper intellectual and you could say worldview predispositions that really connect Ukraine as, the same we could say about Greece. It's not a Catholic or Protestant country, it's an Orthodox country, but there's no problem of calling it part of the Western world or part of Europe, so.
I think one of the ways to write the history of Europe, for example, is the way how different approaches to religion were competing between each other. When we were going there, we were talking about how Protestantism changed itself from the initial very authoritarian views on human nature and on the state. But because of this continuous wars, confrontation, and dialogue with Catholicism is changed to something different. We can say the same about Ukraine. So, for example, the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy is a product of the attempt of Orthodox society to respond to Catholic counter-reformation, but to respond using the language of Catholic counter-reformation, using the conceptual language, but also using the Latin as a language of polemics or Polish. And therefore, we had an amazing situation when we had an Orthodox school in Kyiv, major Kyiv monastery, in which education was in Latin. Unthinkable if you think about the Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, which is very, very anti-Catholic and historically and very, very anti-Latin. Yeah, so these are the paradox, and I think this is what culture is about. It's about the encounter. Well, coming back to the first part of our conversation, it's about things that confront each other in debate, hopefully not going to war, but it's even in European history it was unfortunately very much expressed also during the wartime, and kind of polishing arguments, polishing ideas. And this is what happened in Western European or Central European case in this Catholic Protestant debate, and in Ukrainian case in Catholic Orthodox debate. Plurality is good. Distinction is good. It doesn't mean that it should bring us to. Of course, it has its own limits. And I think that we all need to kind of, it's banality to say, but it's unity in diversity. This is, I think, it's a normal way of society to exist.
Well, a great Lithuanian philosopher of the interwar period, Stasys Šalkauskis, he was really thinking a lot about cultural synthesis and being between East and West and so forth. But one of his ideas was, and I really find it resonates in almost all countries in our region, is exactly this, that this difference of influences of cultural, religious, political ideas coming into contact is a chance for synthesis, but chance for cultural synthesis not in a sort of monistic and imperial sense, but in a sense that it can produce something that is unique, new, or give a sort of a particular shape to something that is universal. And for me, one of the very beautiful phenomena is the Ukrainian Orthodox Baroque architecture. It's very unique. It's something that only in all of the rest of the world. It's a very particular Catholic architectural style, and only Ukraine also has Baroque architecture, which is not Catholic, which is Orthodox architecture. So again, this is a very interesting example of cultural synthesis, and exactly this idea that I think Ukraine is very much this very open and pluralistic society historically, where these different cultural, political, religious, and so on ideas meet, and something new happens out of it. And so I would like to thank you for our conversation. I would remind our listeners that you have been listening to the Right Mind podcast, brought to you by the Institute of European Right. And today, together with us was the Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko, and it was the pleasure of me, Laurynas Peluritis, to ask him some questions and have this debate, and see you in the next episodes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.